Welcome, everyone, to the Fall 23 Distinguished Speaker Series. We're really happy to have you here in the Pastor's School of Business sponsoring this, along with our Center for Cybersecurity as well, because our guest has got that expertise. First of all, I also want to welcome, I know streaming, we've got some of the students in the MBA program that are taking that cybersecurity initiative that's part of that, and I want to welcome you here, so glad that you're here. We're excited to have Ed Wilson here today. Just want to give a brief intro, and then I'm going to pray, and then we'll let him tell us about cybersecurity. So Ed is a very distinguished former officer in the United States Air Force. He has commanded at the squadron level, the wing level, the group level, and at the numbered Air Force level. And after he retired and served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. So he's been in space and he's been in cyber, and he knows the intersection of both of those. And more importantly for me, he was a classmate of mine, and I got to work for him as his vice wing commander when he was wing commander. So I really appreciate his leadership. I've watched him over the years. He's a very effective leader, and part of that is because of his Christian character that is exemplified by how he commanded and led his people in the Air Force. So we'll hear part of that, I'm sure, a little bit tonight. So with that, for you that are in the audience, he's going to give you his talk, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. We've got that mic right down here. So come on down to the mic. Even if you're close by, he might be able to hear you. But remember, we have people online that are getting this streaming, so let's give that benefit. And so with that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I just rejoice that you give us the opportunity to gather together. There's a lot of things happening in this world, a lot of things changing really rapidly. And one of these areas is this issue of cybersecurity. We know that in a fallen world, there's a lot of bad people that want to do bad things. And whether you're a business person, a communication person, a cybersecurity professional, all of us need to have some awareness of the threats that are out there and how we can serve our organizations well by being prepared in the cyber area. So, Lord, I pray that you'll just give us wisdom to listen, to learn a lot. I pray that you'll bless our speaker to help him to communicate effectively. And we want to thank you for bringing him on this glorious, good day that we have and nice weather here in Ohio. Lord, bless this time now and bless our speaker. In Jesus' name, amen.
So Professor Heyman, he's Jeff to me, my apologies, but it's been a long time. We started our Air Force journeys together in 1981. Was anybody in the room born then? Like 3 professors' hands have gone up. Yeah, exactly. Hey, it is a joy to be here, and I just want hats off. Thank you, Professor Heyman, and Professor Heyman, I know he was in the back there for sponsoring this. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. What I'd like to do is maybe we're going to have a bit of a discussion. I'm going to give a talk, but there's going to be Q&A, and I'm really to be honest, I'm excited about that part because then I get to hear what's on your mind, and we get to have a little bit of a discussion. But there's one other person I want to introduce before we get there, and she traveled with me. Normally, she doesn't travel with me. I go quite a few places around the country, around the world, but my wonderful wife is here. This Lisa is sitting down here on the front row. And, Christ is my rock, but she's my other rock. She keeps me grounded and everything. She's the one that tells me, hey, honey, you didn't do so hot in that talk, or, you need to clean your car up, all those little things. So we've been on a 37, well, actually, we met October 5th, 1984. We were at a BYU Air Force football game, and somebody introduced us at halftime. And I kind of caught a glimpse of her, and back then we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have a lot of things. I don't even think we had microwaves back then. But I got her number. I was smart enough to get her number, and we started dating, and we've been on a journey together 37 years plus, married now. We've got a couple of kids, one 30-year-old. I always say former Marine, but the Marines in the crowd usually correct me. There's no former Marines. He just got out a little bit ago, and he used a GI Bill, went back to school, and he's in cybersecurity these days. And then our daughter just moved. She's a Biola grad, was in Fullerton in LA, and she just moved out to Asheville, North Carolina as part of a church plant with the Antioch Church. She's our mission king, queen, whatever. She loves the Lord. Both of the kids do. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into it. I was asked to maybe just do a little bit about me right up front, just to give you a flavor of who is this Ed Wilson guy up on stage talking to you. So I'm going to do a little bit of personal, a little bit of professional. And I'm a little ADD, so I'm going to move around just a bit. I promise I won't come down there unless somebody's snoring really loud. Then I'll probably head down, and wake you up. So Ed Wilson. I grew up, I was born in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, way back when. Any Bama guys or gals in here? Yeah, they see it always happens. So you have to understand professional sports teams. And so when it comes football season, it's kind of like a religion. It really is. And so people don't get too upset about who they root for, but you just have to care about football and when you live in Alabama. It's just kind of the way it is. So my dad was Air Force, so we moved around a little bit. My dad retired. He moved to Alabama, Montgomery. He was stationed in a little place called Maxwell Air Force Base. And I was in the 6th grade when we moved there. And he retired when I was in 9th grade, and they stayed put, never moved after that. But when I was in the 6th grade after that, I went to this thing called Vacation Bible School. I'd never done that before. And a lady that was teaching our class when I was there, Mrs. Oswald, she's a lot older than she was back then these days. Wonderful, wonderful, godly woman. Shared faith, and shared the gospel with me, and I accepted Christ in VBS, and it was a long, long time ago in the 70s. I'll just leave it at that. It was a long time ago. But that kind of started my journey, my Christian journey, and really shaped who I am and how I do things, both personally and professionally. I'm a firstborn. I am a very hard-charging overachiever, and so I love sports. I was a 4-sport kind of athlete. I love playing sports when I was, in high school and junior. We called it junior high back then. And so I had the great opportunity to go to the Air Force Academy, which is where Professor Heyman and I crossed paths for the first time. We showed up June 22nd, 1981 together in basic training and graduated later on in 1985 and started our journey. We both ended up in space operations, and so I spent the next 25 years in space operations, rapid prototype development, that kind of thing. I'm a tech guy. I'm an electrical engineer, digital guy. And so finished up the 25 years, and then I was asked by the Air Force to move over to cyber operations. And so I spent about 8 years wearing a uniform, the last 8 years of my career doing cyber operations. The last operational job was running basically the Air Force network around the world. Had the teams that were doing that, and overseeing both the offensive and defensive cyber operations. And so really a joy. Just wonderful people to work with, great teams, really enjoyed the environment. Was blessed and privileged to be able to do that. And so when I was coming into retirement, I was asked to move to the Pentagon, and so I did a couple of jobs wearing a uniform. But as I was getting ready to retire, the administration asked me if I'd stay on for a few years. To serve as what we describe as the DASD, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. So I spent 2 years in a suit. I wore a tie then, and I didn't wear jeans. I wore fancy clothes. Fix my microphone. My wife is telling me, that one? Is that better? Worse. Jen, come up. Did I? Test 1, 2, 3. Nope. Test 1, 2, 3. Is that better? Back there in the back? I'm seeing thumbs up. Good. So I served for a couple of years as the DASD for Cyber Policy, and in the Q&A, if there's questions along those lines, but we reshaped basically the legal framework in this country with Congress, as well as with the White House, changed how we go about doing offensive and defensive cyber operations around the world. So it was very satisfying, very high impact. When you look for things you do in life, I would point to that professionally as one of the high points, that's for sure. So you're looking at a tech guy. What I'm not, I was in the military for wearing a uniform, an officer for 33 years, wearing a uniform for 37 years, so it's kind of in my blood, and since I grew up in an Air Force family, I was born on an Air Force base, that's kind of who you get, right? You're looking at a person that spent a lot of time around the military. But what I'm not a combat veteran. I'm a tech guy. And so I never had the opportunity to deploy. You know, I wasn't in a unit of fighter jets and all of that. I did space and cyber operations. That's what I did through my career. But probably the closest matter of fact, in uniform, I don't think I was ever shot at. I think the only time I've ever been shot at was maybe in Alabama in high school dove hunting. I think I had a few stray rounds heading our way. That's about the closest I've ever gotten to conflict, if you will. But what I'd like to do is kind of shift. And one other thing I'd like to share, just so kind of everybody that's worked around me, then Colonel Heyman knew this upwards, you know, forward and backwards. I kind of had a motto, 4 big words, and in the 4 F's, my kids tease me about it. It was faith, family, friends, and freedom. And it kind of formed the ethos that I used in life through my professional career to kind of shape how I went about doing things. So faith is, you know, my faith was the foundation, my Christian faith in terms of what I did. It helped, that was that touchstone, the guide star, you know, if you will, North Star, if you will, to be able to make decisions in a lot of ways, ethical and moral, you know, compass, if you will. And it just shapes who you are and who you know, how you interact with people. Friends and family, you know, they're the joy of why you do things. And then, you know, the calling was, I've been in the national security arena my whole life, pretty much, my adult life. And so, you know, that's what the job's all about, is sustaining, you know, maintaining freedom in this country and defending our national interests. So that kind of shapes who I am. So I just wanted to spend just a few minutes doing that. What I'd like to do, I'm going to spend a little bit talking about my interpretation of where we are in the cyber arena. We're going to talk about what it is, some trends that are going on, what the threat looks like, kind of a big picture. I'd love to geek out on you and talk about, you know, servers and switches and routers and all that for the cybersecurity folks in the room, but we're not going to go there. We're going to stay up a high level. And then if someone wants to get into that, we'll do that afterwards. I'll hang around. If you want to geek out on something, I'd be more than happy to do that. But with an audience this size, how many cybersecurity folks majors do we have in the room? Yeah, see, they're all down front, you know. Okay. So other majors are kind of all in the back, right? So, yeah, when we use this word cyber, I think it's important to, what are we talking about, right? So in my mind, the word has a couple of uses. So one, I use the term cyberspace to differentiate it as a domain, if you will. As a national security person, we think of air, land, sea, space as operational domains. Domains that have physical properties to them that we conduct operations in. Cyberspace is one of those, but there's a difference. The other 4 domains are natural. They behave because of physics. You can predict well in advance what's going to happen. Typically, when you have a lot of knowns, you can predict that. Cyberspace is different. And when we talk about, I'll go into more detail about what forms cyberspace, but it's a man-made domain. So you have to think about it differently. Every day it changes. Somebody plugs a new computer in, cyberspace just changed. Somebody drops a new version of software in, a malware comes alive and is moving through something, a Trojan or new ransomware attack, all these things going on. It changes every day, every second really, around the world. It's a global domain, and it's kind of the glue that holds a lot of things together, not just as a military guy, the national security apparatus, but how many people have a phone? I gave mine to my wife before we started, but everybody in this room has a phone, right? Cell phone? I'd be aghast if somebody didn't have a cell phone, right? You've got a piece of cyberspace in your pocket or wherever you're keeping it. Computers, it's the way that we communicate. As an individual, you have access to information around the world, right? Unprecedented access to information globally. All of the pretty much archives that are available in a fingertip. You know, you don't have to really go to the library like you used to. You don't have to read, you don't have to go to books, et cetera. It's all at your fingertips. Businesses rely on it. Militaries use it. The downside is that's the good, but there's a bad side to cyberspace too. And that has grown at pace, and we'll talk about that. So, the productivity is there, the ability to communicate at scale. One attribute that I think has really been amplified is the ability for an individual to have an outsized impact on the world. In the old days when we didn't have an internet, we didn't have all of this, it was very difficult for someone to mobilize a society, to mobilize a faction. Nowadays, when you look at what we do with, people do with Twitter, et cetera, and Facebook and everything else, it's easy to mobilize, it's easy to communicate, and we kind of take it for granted. When it goes down, we feel it, right? But the other places that this thing called cyber or cyberspace touches is in the critical infrastructure elements that undergird modern society. And so things like water, electric, any kind of utility that you would use at your home, telecommunications, transportation, to include airplanes and trains and cars, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure folks in this room have seen, YouTube videos of people hacking into cars these days. That is a whole new element that, just even 10, 15 years ago, we really didn't deal with. And so when you think about cyberspace, you have to move through and think about that. There's a set of technologies that has come along that is really amplifying everything that I just kind of laid out in summary. And it's everybody in this room, I'm sure, has heard of generative, artificial intelligence and the generative AI that we've got running right now. Large language, the ability to digest huge amounts of data, no matter what language it's in. If it's in English or Mandarin Chinese, the more, French, Spanish, et cetera, there's a lot of data out there. And to be able to articulate and solve problems without a human in the loop. And it's based on these models that are out there. And we'll get into how those are being used in a productive fashion, but also how that's a threat. So we've seen exponential growth also with the pace of cyber threats is unprecedented right now. And so there's a whole list of things, categories that are involved in the cyber threats that you face. You may not realize you're facing it. There's nation states out there that we all operate as a nation in cyberspace for national security reasons. We do that, the threats being in the categories of, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. Terrorist groups are operating within this space. The pace that those threats are accelerating in terms of the complexity of the technologies they're using is unprecedented. When you look at history, I would be hard-pressed, and I think anybody in this room would be hard-pressed to identify a threat to individuals and to society as a whole that has accelerated as fast as what we're seeing in the cyber domain today. It's because the technology is prolific. It proliferates very easily. Once it's used and it's out in the wild, anybody can pick that up. I would point to a couple of historical examples. Would be in Iran, there was a concern with regards to their nuke program, the nuclear program that they were running, and a malware type was unleashed to be able to take those out. I'll leave who was involved in that. That's a matter of debate as to who that was that put that malware on those systems. But what's interesting is once that was used, if you started a clock, and it was a very successful attack through cyberspace and took down some of the most potent hardware within Iran at the time and set them back a couple of years by most estimates. Within about 2 months, that software, that malware began to be seen in a different form, but the kernel, the same software, the core of that software began to be used. The Stuxnet is what it was called. Malware was used, and we began to see it in the wild. When you think of threats like other domains, it doesn't happen that fast. In cyberspace, everything's collapsed and compressed temporally. So it's a real challenge, whether you're in the commercial sector or in the national security sector. So nation states, when you look at them, they're typically kind of broken down their objectives, if you will. And I would put the U.S. in a couple of these categories, if you will, but most of the threats that we worry about are very aggressive in this categories. One is they're after intellectual property. They want to steal intellectual property, especially when it has to do with weapon systems and those things. But when you look at a country like China, for instance, over the last 15 years or so, they've had a national policy of stealing intellectual property, not just national security, but technology areas, sectors of information to help accelerate their growth. And so pretty common knowledge, I'm sure people that have studied this have been, are familiar with it in some regards. But I think when you think of threats like China, I think you really need to stop and understand that culturally, they don't operate like a democratic Western society. There's no differentiation between like an operation that the United States or one of our allies might run, where we are interested in a weapons development, and we might go steal that information to understand what the threat looks like, but we don't take that data and turn around and hand it to our industry sector. We don't hand that to Lockheed Martin or Boeing, those types of activities. In China and other countries like it, they don't differentiate there. So they will hand information over, whether it has to do with solar panels or fighter jets or any type of technology that is seen as lucrative to be able to stand up an economic juggernaut. And what happens is, once they have that in hand, they'll begin to finance and stand up a business competitor within, on the international stage. And so those dynamics are all mobilized and enabled by cyber threats, cyber activity, cyber operations. The other is, you see from nation states, is the interest in critical infrastructure. It's been all over the news lately. We've seen it for years, but it's really been in the news a lot lately. China sitting on critical infrastructure, like in Guam, was just in the news, if you've been watching the front line of the news just a couple months ago. They were sitting on critical infrastructure like power and water on island. Why? Well, because the United States has a lot of military activity in that area. And so they want to be able to hold those critical infrastructure segments at risk. And so we're beginning to see that in spades all over the world. And so that affects a society like ours, any modern society, because we rely on that critical infrastructure. So that has become a real accelerant, if you will, on the defensive side, trying to understand what those threats look like and then how do we protect critical infrastructure for a nation. And I'll touch on that when I get to the difference between like a democratic, free, open society and an autocratic society. There's some differences in the way those are being handled. In addition, we see this out of Russia a lot. They're probably the masters at this, is disinformation campaigns. And so using remote operations through cyber space to be able to influence a population or a group or an organization. And so at the strategic level. In the military, we do information operations quite often, but it's tactical, it's more on the ground, if you will. Russia has elevated that game in a significant way. So if anybody was paying attention to the 2016, 2018 elections, Russia was seeding discontent, disinformation into our elections during those periods. That cuts at the heart of who we are as a nation when a nation uses techniques like that within the cyber domain, breaks all the norms of behavior that you would ever lay out as a country when that goes on. So Russia's at the front of the line. There's others that are beginning to do that. That's beginning, especially with some of these generative AI models, is really getting to be a problem. And with, I'll call it the fake news models, where people are doing, staining up videos, et cetera, make-believing like something's going on. I think where we see as citizens in this country, domestically, the biggest actor is criminal behavior, cyber criminals. And has anybody had to get a credit card replaced in the last couple of years because somebody's hacked into their account? Yes, no, maybe. It's kind of interesting. The credit card companies gotten much better at this. When I asked that question maybe 5-6 years ago, like 3/4 of the hands in an audience would go up. That's not as much of a problem. Where it is getting to be a problem is within the banking infrastructure itself, where criminals, cyber criminals now are using, hacking in and actually, stealing Bitcoin, those kinds of things. The other big activity that we're beginning to see a lot of is the ransomware. They're using that to be able to hold, key elements of a society at risk. Typically organized crime elements emanating in proxy actors for Russia, et cetera. We see hacktivists more from an ideological side, very active in this domain, and it bleeds into society. Terrorists, for a long while, were very active in this space. And then, the last one would be insider threat, which is mostly discontented employees, others that are going to wield some kind of an attack on an organization. And so I know that's kind of a laundry list of activities, but for those that aren't familiar, it kind of shapes how you have to think about this space, both from a productive sense as well as the threat that's out there. I think there's some trends that are running right now within this whole arena called cyber and cybersecurity. One is the innovation, the pace of innovation is unprecedented in any area that has really existed in human society. The pace at which, and I point at it again, but as generative AI is a great example. It's up front, the Chat GPT, et cetera. You can't hardly turn the news on and not see elements of that hard at work. I'm sure professors here are contending with, are you allowed to use those AI models, those AI capabilities in a school environment? Is that cheating or not? Or is that using some of the best technology in the world to be able to learn, right? So it's very disruptive in that case. But the innovation cycles are accelerating so fast. If it's bringing some powerful capability, if you're in business, if you're in manufacturing, if you're in the banking sector, if you're in almost any other arena within an economic front, it's huge. But it is going to be disruptive in terms of jobs that are available in certain sectors. If there's something that's rote, that's requiring information of some flavor that you're bringing and fusing together, that job is going to be put at risk as these capabilities continue to develop. The other is that we're seeing a challenge in this arena is, and I kind of hinted at it earlier, these generative AI models that are running in this domain, they're great when you're in an area that has large databases of known language characteristics. English, for instance, the different types of dialects within the United States or in the UK, et cetera. Those models learn very quickly and are very effective. But when you move to areas of the world like Africa, Asia, where there's a lot more dialects and a lot more languages that are beginning, those models can't train as quickly because there's not as much data out there. And so it's interesting, you kind of have the haves and the have-nots in this arena right now. But my guess is since there's business cases that can be made, that's going to accelerate all over the world. We're seeing exponential growth in the threat, whether that's criminal activity, proxies, the nation states that I pointed out. One thing we are beginning to see is technology moves and as nations become more involved, it's really China and the US are kind of where at loggerheads right now, is the US believes to its core that there should be a fair, open internet, that anybody should be able to access the information on the internet, and that information should move to any citizen in our country. The Europeans, EU, in most cases, the same. Most developed Western democratic societies believe in that. When you pivot the other direction and you begin to look at China, Russia, and some of the other autocratic societies, they don't like that because they believe that's a risk to their societies. And so you see the autocratic societies locking down and building, we refer to it as the Great China Firewall, in China, that controls the flow of information, and it's exporting those kinds of capabilities to other countries, especially in Africa and some of the underdeveloped. they're actually subsidizing and pushing those systems out. If you're a dictator in a country, it's a wonderful tool to be able to suppress citizens. But from our belief system and the way that we believe norms and behavior should be running, is that, we're at loggerheads. What's quickly beginning to form is this contention, if you will, between those two thoughts, and that's beginning to bleed into the technology, where you're seeing kind of we call it a balkanization. It's the division of different societies that have different rules of behavior. And if you're a corporation doing business in different countries, there's a whole different set of rules that have to apply. Another example of a difference we're seeing that's a trend that's really accelerating, it's beginning to catch on. California's just passed several laws in this direction. They call it GDPR in the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation. And they're very serious about yours, mine, any individual that's an EU citizen being protected in terms of privacy. So they have choices, and there are rules of behavior on what information could be exposed out on the internet or sold on the internet by any provider. There's hefty fines. There's several corporations that have gotten fined tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars by violating those. We're beginning to see other areas, other regions move in that direction. And so that's a huge shift. That's a big kind of shift, if you will, in this arena. So the last area that in terms of a trend is on the workforce side. Like a lot of technologies, there just aren't enough people. So all you cybersecurity people in the room, you're coming into a workforce or a workforce environment which is your talents are in high demand. Recent estimates in this country, 600 to 800,000 open jobs in the marketplace right now, not just in IT, but just in cybersecurity. And so when you look globally, estimates anywhere from about 1.5 to 4 million people short. And so it's an interesting dilemma that we're in. I've been a huge advocate while in government and out I think we really need to look at the problem, especially I'm looking at it through national security lens, but we can't rely on just universities pumping out the right kind of talent. I think we need to get to students earlier in their learning cycle, like in middle school is where we're finding the most success. A lot of kids go into high school and then go into college and don't have exposure to some of the technology, some of the skill sets, math skills, those kinds of things. So they're ill prepared to even have the option to move into that. It takes them a while to cycle. But if you get them interested early, I'll just point at an example. The Air Force has a great program. It's a nonprofit partnership with industry, but it's called Cyber Patriot. Last year it was about 40,000 kids in middle school and high school. So about a 8-month program, 7-month program where they get taught in school in an extracurricular kind of activity and move through the program, and then there's competition. The secret sauce is private involvement, companies' involvement with mentors. There's competition and some education to top it off. Interest in cybersecurity or IT-related matters coming into the program typically hover around 15 to 20% of the kids are interested in it. They just kind of want to do it. They've heard cyber's kind of cool. They want to try it out. Some of their friends are doing it. Coming out of the program one cycle, the interest rate moves up in the 65 to 70% category. What's been fascinating is when you watch the kids over the last 10 to 12 years now that have moved out of high school into college or into the university setting, those kids are following through. And we're seeing out of that 60 some odd percent block of kids that over half are going into STEM educations of some flavor, which has been kind of a weakness in our society, especially when you look at the Chinese juggernaut that's out there. And so I'm a big believer in kind of growing the denominator, if you will, when you think about age, is you get kids more involved. It's like any other thing, getting kids interested in something they'll have a passion about, whether it's a STEM-related activity, an arts-related activity, but that they can find their way and then begin to prepare so that when they show up in settings like this, they actually have some of the basic skill sets to be successful. They're not trying to catch up, if you will. So that's a challenge in this country. The trends are all in the wrong direction, to be honest, and they have been for a number of years. But I think we need more public-private partnerships like the Cyber Patriot program as we move along. So what I'd like to do maybe is I'm going to hit the pause button because I've been talking probably too long. And what I'd like to do is just kind of open it up for Q&A, and then I'll tap it off with some, I'm going to break from cyber and just talk to you about, as future Christian leaders in society, maybe some takeaways, some things that might be of interest to you, okay? So with that, the mics are open. If you could wander up. Who's going to dare to be the first one? I usually have a chocolate bar or something in my pocket to pitch to the first person. I dropped the ball there. I didn't bring one.
I'm an Army signal soldier, and we dabble a lot in the Security Plus, Network Plus kind of certifications. What kind of certifications would you recommend to business students to learn some foundational things for their business endeavors after they graduate?
Yeah, like an A++ kind of cert is kind of a nice, easy start, gives you a feel for it, the environment and what's going on. The challenge sometimes will be the techie part of it. It can be a challenge. That's what I've seen. There's some courses like the SANS offers that don't really have a certification involved, but are an overview, kind of an intro into IT or cybersecurity or both. That are available, and there's other organizations similar to SANS. If you've got certs, you know what I'm talking about, that are pretty good, that I think are nice, dip your toe in. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
No trouble.
I currently serve in the National Guard, and our base just transferred from a mission support wing to a cyber warfare wing. And there's definitely a shift in the military, as far as I can see, towards being more cyber focused. And do you think that come the invasion of Taiwan, if China ever decides to do that, do you think if that goes poorly, it could result in a World War III type scenario?
So I'm doubtful that we'll have an escalation. I think what would happen is China's going to be very interested in escalating something to stop our interference. And my fear would be that we would see attacks on the nation domestically in the CONUS, continental U.S., in a regional fashion to send a message. In other words, the lights go out in, pick a region, power goes down, et cetera, to say, this is a local thing, stop, you're messing in our turf. There's been, when you look at what's just occurred in Guam, in terms of our projection of force into the region, that's obviously what is clearly on the list of things that the objectives they're trying to achieve. My fear is as we move along, there's going to be risk to the homeland as well. And we're not used to that, right? We've never, since the Civil War, in the War of 1812, we haven't had anybody attack the homeland, right? So that is not in our psyche. And I think what the cyber threat offers an adversary is the ability to strike at the homeland in some fashion. And the Chinese are good enough to do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
15 years ago, I wouldn't have said that. The Chinese weren't good enough, but they are today. Yeah.
So quantum computers I've seen have been on more of a rise recently. So what are your views on
more
quantum computers, just like the use of them and utilization? What are your views on the implications of how that impacts cybersecurity?
Quantum computing and quantum encryption, the ability to break core encryption today. So for those that don't, I'll just quick backdrop. Computers today in today's parlance is indications of either a 0 or a 1 physically on a chip. There's things that happen on a chip, and you get two choices. It's either a 0 or a 1, and out of that becomes all of the processing that goes on in your phone and computers and everything else. Quantum takes that to another level where there are, say, 6 to 8 to 10 options in a physical manifestation. So there's a lot more data that's now moving and able to be stored and then processed at very, very rapid rates. Won't get into all the geeky technology on how it happens. So as quantum computers come online, there's some working computers today, like IBM and a couple others have out there today, but it takes too much power to do useful things. We're quickly probably going to get there in the next 8, 12, 16 years, somewhere in that range is what most people project, where useful applications will be able to be handled in quantum computing, and it's going to change the world in terms of the speed, the power of the things that can be done. We're so limited today in what we can do compared to what will be happening when quantum processing comes on board. So I'm a huge believer. Again, I'm kind of a national security guy, so I look at the threat that comes from that. Anything that anybody has today that's encrypted, even with, for the military folks in the room, or type 1 encryption, will be put at risk. Any data that's on any platform today, commercial encryption, will be useless in a quantum era. So there's countries, I'll leave the countries unnamed, that are hoarding information today with the hopes of, once quantum computing comes to bear, that they'll be able to reach back and use that encrypted data and leverage it in whatever fashion they choose. So it's a game changer. It's going to take us a while to get there, from power and the ability to cool things down physically to make it happen. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the need for people in the cyber field, and I know that technically the answer to this question is both, but do you see a greater need in cyber offensive or cyber defensive?
So I'm a believer in both. I'll give you a feel for it. So we started standing up what we call the Cyber Mission Force about 10 years ago. In 2012, we made the decision as a nation to stand this force up in the Department of Defense. About 2/3 of that force in total is defensive, and about 1/3 is offensive. So that gives you a flavor of the way strategically we thought about it. I would argue that when you have a good offensive team, you do have advantage in this space. It's not like the other physical domains. Usually in the other physical domains, if you're on defense, especially land warfare or air and even sea, you have an advantage being in the defensive posture because you can bring forces to bear in a much more concentrated fashion. You don't have long lines of logistics. That doesn't happen in cyberspace. So you have the element of surprise, and you can, knock foes off. We see that over and over again in war games. So,
Thank you.
no trouble.
So you mentioned how the Western world versus the Eastern world in general. Western wanted to have everybody have internet. Eastern didn't. So what do you think
Well, it
about?
wants its own internet. So it
Yes,
wants to
okay.
control what's coming and going on
Right.
the internet. Yeah.
So what do you think about organizations like Starlink trying to create a worldwide internet?
I'm a huge fan. So I think we've seeing that play out in Ukraine right now. And this the juncture between space and cyber, which that's my sweet spot, right? So when you look at the way the SpaceX team was able to deploy 10,000 terminals into Ukraine, Starlink terminals into Ukraine, there's probably 30 to 40,000 terminals in Ukraine right now, minus the ones that have been destroyed in combat, has been a game changer. It really has. To be able to have in a mobile fashion or command and control, or for society to be able to operate, just grocery stores, all of the above, to order food, just the backbone of society and the telecommunications, and have internet at hand, it's been a game changer. So now the question is how it gets much more difficult if you're broadcasting the internet globally into a region to you've got to go from that terminal to the internet infrastructure, the telecommunications infrastructure. It's hard to operate. You're on a node basically by yourself. Once you plug in, you're seen. So that's where, like in China and others, you'll get the information locally, but it's hard to make it network into society at large and start to broadcast and those kinds of things. Once you do that, they see you. And guess what happens? They roll you out, is what happens today. And so, but it will be a disruptive force for sure, especially early in any type, temporarily, very early in any activity, whether that's conflict or crisis mode or whatever, it will be a disruptor. And Starlink's just the first of what will be many, OneWeb, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be many of them there. Just to put in perspective, so right now, so we live on the Space Coast down in Florida. Starlink right now has about over 2,000 satellites in orbit just for Starlink. They have already been licensed to go to 6,000 in low Earth orbit. It's mind-boggling. And there's other companies that are right behind them with very similar structures. So, great question.
Thank you.
Thanks. I know the feeling. Yeah, I'm not tall.
Since a lot of offensive cyber involves a lot of deception, what would be your approach to working in that as a Christian?
So when I think about military operations for the nation at large, I don't believe there's an issue with regards to the tactics and techniques that you need to be successful in war and the survival of a soldier, airman, marine, etc. So deception's been used in many, many different domains. I personally don't see an issue there because we're called to defend the nation, your country. It's pretty common. And so I think to be using a deceptive tactic in war, conflict, or some kind of crisis, I think when we deceive people for disinformation purposes, society at large, I do have an issue. I think that's a bit of a problem from a Christian mindset. I think now we're beginning to tip in the direction of trying to deceive a whole population, and I think that's where we begin to cross boundaries. But in a time of war or conflict, it's a bit different. There's a little bit different set of rules at play.
Thank you.
Yeah, so me being an international student, this question kind of generates in me. So are there like options for internationals to serve in the cyber defense in the military? And if so, like what certifications do they need or what exams do they need to give?
So absolutely, U.S. citizen, not U.S. citizen?
Not U.S. citizens.
Not a U.S. citizen. So the limits in terms of the classifications that can be had, the Department of Defense, you're going to have a little bit of an issue. You'd have to go through a naturalization process and then move in. There's other organizations like the FBI, DHS, Department of Homeland Security that also run those just through the government. And then as a country, we use a lot of commercial cybersecurity apparatus also we hire, and there are a lot of international players. Now, if it's going to touch a high priority or a classified system, then you won't be able to work on that. Yeah. So we do draw a line, but all nations do that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
No trouble. There's a lot of opportunity, I guess, the message. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about in the old days of nuclear war or the possibility of nuclear war, we had policies for mutual assured destruction, deterrence. Are there any things that we do strategically as a nation, or at least think about, with regard to if we are worried about certain players, national players, that we do something to deter them? We let them know of our capabilities so that they might decide that it's not in their best
Right.
interest to exercise
Right.
theirs.
Absolutely. So if you use the term cyber deterrence, I think that's where I would maybe part ways with you. I think if you think about strategic deterrence as a nation or with allies, I think we do things in cyber, and I'll walk through this in just a second, alongside other national instruments of power. So to think of a cyber tit for tat as a deterrence construct strategically, I think is self-limiting. You've fallen right into the trap so that now you're getting outgunned. I think when we think of strategic deterrence, which I would put, the mutually assured destruction into that category, we use not just nuke for nuke, but we used a whole array of other national instruments of power. The difference in cyber is because of the proliferation issue and the complexity, there are cyber actors out there that have tools and are right behind. The degrees of separation, it's not the Soviet Union and the United States head to head and you can contain what's going on. And attribution is very discrete in the arena that we grew up in, from a strategic deterrence with nukes. When you're doing and dealing with offensive cyber capabilities, attribution is not immediate sometimes, quite often. If you've got really good intelligence, you can see it and peg it right away. At times, it takes you a bit to work through and figure out specifically where that came from. So think of it in a traditional strategic deterrence construct. There's cost imposition, right? You're going to put some kind of imposition. That could be economic, that could be a strike, military strike, kinetically, non-kinetically. There's lots of options, right? Then there's you cost avoidance. In other words, you avoid the ability. So that's the defensive constructs. Critical infrastructure, let's harden it. Our forces make them resilient, right, in a contested environment. I would argue that thinking of entanglement, and what I mean by that is international cooperation so that collective defense constructs in this space are very, very important. And that puts in play indirect potential to be able to deter an actor like a China or Russia or those kinds of things. If there's 20 of us that are going to come at them in a collective defense construct, not just cyber, that is a high degree of deterrence in many cases. We're seeing that in terms of the Ukraine thing blowing up outside because of the NATO Article 5 collective defense construct. So I think there's the mechanisms are very similar. The strategic environment that we're operating on with in cyber, and are we going to deter cyber criminals from dropping ransomware on a business? That's hard to deter. But if you notice, organized crime elements they've quit going after large enterprises. So for instance, the JBS strike that occurred about a year and a half ago, Brazilian meat company went down, the Colonial Pipeline. You're beginning to see, because the government has now involved and we're unleashing the intelligence community, Department of Defense and others, FBI, against those kinds of attacks because they're having implications on the homeland. They're holding their activities below thresholds of our response. So it depends on who you're deterring, is where I'm going.
Yes, sir. And a second question is, there have been historically various kinds of laws of war for encroaching on national boundaries. But it's difficult to understand national boundaries in the world of cyberspace. Are there people thinking through how you would describe those kinds of things to build international reproach on a person that breaks cyber boundaries?
Yeah, so cyber doesn't behave within national boundaries typically. Telecommunications companies don't, the internet isn't built that way. So it's not a respecter of borders in many cases. There are some exceptions. If you look at China, for instance, their infrastructure is built around the boundaries physically. So any information entering the nation now is in the nation. They have access to it. Which is why if you're a company doing business in China, they route your information into China so that they can store it and then take advantage of it, exploit it, right? The answer is yes. We worry about operations that occur where the end game is, and so there's policy apparatus. Some of it can be very sensitive, but yes, if you're going to move through a third country, there's discussions that go on about how that's handled. So absolutely, State Department's involved in anything that goes on from our country alongside anything we do with partner countries.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a check and a balance there, absolutely.
So you have mentioned how there's an increase of AI around the world and recently, and also an increase of ransomware also recently. So have you seen that the two have correlated together? And then also, following up on that, how can companies possibly use AI to fight against that? Or is that even a chance?
So the answer is we are seeing ransomware, the development of ransomware and other malware, like implants that are being developed using AI techniques. We're beginning to see that. It's mind-boggling what's going on, how fast it's moving. Companies already use machine learning and AI for defensive purposes in cybersecurity. The advanced users, you almost have to. You got to get people out of you want to respond in an automated fashion to any kind of an attack to the best of your ability. If you're putting people in the loop and doing manual processes, you are already behind in today's world. That used to work 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, not in today's environment. Things are moving so fast. So the answer across all of that is, yes, we're seeing AI merge on both the criminal side, the adversary side. We're seeing it in the defensive side for the good guys out there, white hats and everybody else. It's upgunning everybody's game. Is probably the simplest way to say that.
So, just thinking about that, so the AI can only work as well as its data set, like you said, and have all these attacks that have happened in the past been collected so then companies can use the AI to work with that data of past attacks?
There's a lot of forensics data out there, and there's archives of malware types. You can go on Virus Total, which is a Google-supported effort, and you can look at all kinds of viruses and malware that's out there. It's kind of one of many archives that are out there. The Carnegie Mellon team for the government keeps our kind of archive of the forensics that's run, and it has all of the malware types going back 20, 30 years. And so the answer is yes, both commercially and in government, there are archives so that you can recognize and understand the signatures of what's coming at it and how it's been used. So there's a lot of data out there that could be used in this fashion, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
It's a nasty world. Any other questions?
Of course, there's another question.
Oh.
So I know you do a lot of consulting now with your own business, and we've got a lot of great tech kind of discussion, but what are you seeing in terms of the commercial world trying to get their handle on that? What does the business do now? And I don't know whether you have any kind of feel for kind of from small business, how do they think about it? How do bigger business and what you're seeing in your world?
Yeah, so I think the bigger enterprises, if you move into like the financial sector, fintech arena, they're usually the cutting edge when it comes to cybersecurity and the defenses against any of these threat types, no matter criminal, most of it's criminal, but even if it's like North Korea will run operations in the banking sector to harvest money to pay for missile development, those kinds of things. And so large enterprises, large manufacturers, if you're an IT firm, all of the above, they do pretty well on their own. They've got mature, not always impervious, but very mature programs. Where it's not a fair fight in today's world, is the small and medium-sized businesses and enterprises, organizations, universities, right, that are vulnerable without help. It really is a problem. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations, small businesses or medium-sized businesses, they're beginning to outsource rather than rely on the IT shop that has 3 or 4 people, or small businesses like one person that just graduated from high school or college is pretty good at wiring up computers and running a network. That's not a fair fight when you're unleashing some of the best talent in the world against that kind of company. Now, depending on what you do, you may not be a target. However, if there's money involved or intellectual property involved or a service that can be held at risk to gain money and ransom, you're going to be a target. And so most criminal elements look for vulnerabilities. They look for the weak, It's like when you're running from a bear. You only have to be as faster than the slowest person, right? That's the person, that's the company, that's the organization that's at most risk. And so the smart companies invest. They think of it like any other business risk. This is like continuity risk, if you will, and they bring in some expertise. And you can outsource and let companies come in and they'll run your security stack for you in this space. And that's the common denominator. The good companies do that. And yeah. And then for the techies, I can go into more detail in our other session. Excellent. I think we're about 15 out or so? Okay. Sure. Terrific. Any other questions? Y'all are like policy experts. I wish I had you working for me in cyber policy when I was there. Yeah. So, hey, I want to just, as we wrap up, maybe just offer some advice. I don't know, counsel for someone, for young men and women that are going to be graduating from this institution in some juncture. You're going to become Christian leaders, future leaders, whether you know it or not, whether you realize it or not. And you might be a leader in a small organization. You may go on to run, large enterprises, et cetera. Maybe just a little bit of just things that I wish somebody had told me. Nothing is like earth-shattering. You've probably heard it before, but here's some counsel from a guy named Ed Wilson. So first is, when you come into an organization and you're beginning to be a leader, I would encourage you to think and understand that leadership and management are two different things. And what do I mean by that? We lead people and we manage things. Don't think about managing people. You manage assets in a company or an organization. When are we going to change the carpet in this room? When are we going to put a new roof on top? Are we going to give a pay raise out this year? Are we going to incentivize some new activity? The business decisions or nonprofit, what have you. You can teach management skills and make decisions in that arena. Don't confuse management with how to motivate people that you're working alongside peers, or if I call it leading up, you've got bosses that can be contentious, or when you become a leader, whether you're overseeing 2 or 3 people, or 100 people, or 1,000 people or more, you lead people. And so when you think about it that way, it strikes a different behavior. And as a Christian, I think you think of it as a service. You're in a service, you're serving those people. Doesn't mean that you put up with subpar performance. It doesn't mean, that you're soft in a way. But the way that you interact with people, the way that you communicate with them, you uphold standards, you be a good model, those are the signs of a leader. And so leadership comes with working with people. And I think as Christians, we need more Christian leaders in whatever business arena or whatever sector of life there is. Not just in church and ministry, we need leaders in all sectors, if you will. Finance, manufacturing, insurance, military, etc. With that thought, as I moved through my career, it dawned on both my wife and I as we moved on, we treated our service in the military as our ministry. That we were there to do God's work in the military. Now, I had a job to do in terms of delivering the right kind of outcomes for the nation from a military perspective, from a national security perspective, but I think it changes the way that you interact with people. The second would be, anybody know, it's a really famous literary work from the 1920s. I think you'll recognize it. Anybody know Winnie the Pooh? All right. Anybody like Winnie the Pooh? Anybody read it? My mom and dad used to read it to us when we were kids. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Winnie the Pooh. I'm going to talk about this. You remember the blue donkey? What's his name? Eeyore. All right. Eeyore's kind of a crusty old guy, right? He always down, right? He always had a flippant comment that was kind of negative. Has anybody worked around an Eeyore? Or have someone in their life that's an Eeyore? They're always dragging their tail, well, when it's not attached, But that Eeyore effect of always being negative. I would challenge you that when you get out of school, it still works in school, but when you're out of this university and graduate, you go into your life, whatever you do in your professional career, is don't be an Eeyore. Be positive. And whatever walk of life you end up in. I would argue that people that are positive, especially as you become leaders in whatever walk of life you move into, have an outsized impact in a good way on any organization, on any team, no matter how small it is. When someone comes to work with the right attitude, it uplifts everybody. When you come in with a negative attitude, it's a downer for everybody. So much so that through my career, I would rather have someone working with me, around me, for me, whichever, that had the right kind of attitude and may not be quite as competent as the other person over here. There might be the A-team talent, if you will, but had a bad attitude. I really don't want that in my team's mix. I would rather have someone with a positive attitude, and we will train them up, and I guarantee you that we will get better performance out of a team knocked down every day of the week. I promise you. Don't be an Eeyore, all right? Be positive. I promise you it will pay in dividends. Any scouts in the room? Boy Scouts? I don't know if they do this in Girl Scouts. Boy Scouts in the room? All right, so this one won't be foreign to you. It's be prepared. When I say be prepared, is no matter whenever you're going into some kind of situation, is take the time to be prepared. It's amazing how many times people show up in a meeting, in an event, in whichever, and they're not prepared. If you show up prepared, one, you have a lot more confidence, and you're going to get better outcomes. Sometimes when I know I've kind of shortcut, and then all of a sudden I'm wondering, there's a big crash at the end, and I'm wondering, what the heck happened? Why didn't that go the way I thought? And then you kind of think back, I really didn't put a team talent into this. I didn't put my game into this to get ready. We've got it in our family, we got a little saying, it's P5, proper preparation prevents poor performance. My kids hate it. They hate it, they hate it, they hate it. Even to this day, the 30-year-old looks at me like, rolls his eyes. But it pays off, let me tell you. It just pays off. So be prepared. Don't show up. The alternative is not good. I'll just leave it at that. The next is never, ever give up. Keep the faith. Our God is big enough to handle any situation. But it requires you not to give up. So stay at it. Even when it's hard, you got headwinds, you got to do this, and you're walking that way uphill, with wind and rain in your face. And when you go back, it's the same way you're going uphill. Those kind of situations, it just never seems to end. We all go through it. Don't give up. And lean on your faith. It's a great place to be. I think you will find resilience in those moments when you need it, but don't give up. And the last one I would share with you is to be a man or woman of integrity. I have watched careers that are stellar, and people slip up, and they make really bad decisions from an integrity or morals perspective. Affairs, those kinds of things. Somebody decides they're going to file a voucher and they add a little bit that they didn't really spend because they can get $50, a couple $100 a few times. And I've watched whole careers of really promising talent, just great people, but they lose sight of where they're at. And there's people watching. And as a Christian, especially as a Christian leader, that emanates in ways that you just can't imagine. But it's the quickest way to just lose your credibility, to lose your reputation. And to be honest, it takes months, years, decades to build a reputation in a business environment. And people remember, they don't forget bad actors. It sticks with you. And so I know it gets preached here quite a bit, but from a person that's been out, in the military, and I'm in business now, running my own business, just leave it at that. Be a man or woman of integrity. And I think that you would find between those, understand the difference between leadership and management, be positive in all things you do, show up prepared in every engagement as best as you can. Sometimes it's hard, it really is. And keep the faith. Our God's big enough. And then the last one is integrity, integrity, integrity. I think you'll find that life is much more rich. I think outcomes become easier. I don't know if easier is the right word. They just seem to happen that way. I don't know. I don't know why, but they do. Troubles aren't as hard sometimes, but I would offer you those kind of words of wisdom. So with that, I'm going to give you back 6 minutes of your life early. And I appreciate you being attentive, and I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the time. I really do. Godspeed to everybody, and thank you.
And with that, you are dismissed. General Wilson will be down in front if you have some personal questions you'd like to ask him.